Welcome to part 3 of Disabilities, Diversity, and Inclusion. What does ableism look like? This is the third part of a 4-part program designed to introduce parents, caregivers, providers, and people with disabilities to the concept of ableism. After completing the program, you will not only be able to recognize ableism, you will also be able to apply what you have learned to dismantle it. Before we begin, I would like to review these 2 content notes. First, this program contains references to ableism and some offensive language. This information is included for the purposes of educating others on the harm caused by ableism. Second, this presentation uses both person-first and identity-first language interchangeably, since either may be used depending on individual preference. When interacting with people with disabilities, it's important to consider individual preferences. As you may recall from part 1, we'll use 4 questions to guide us on our study of ableism, including: what is ableism? Why does it matter? What does ableism look like? And what can we do about it? Part 1 looked at the question, what is ableism, by offering you some definitions, a framework for how ableism appears in our thoughts and our actions, and some history and models that are commonly used to explain ableist behavior. In part 2, we explored the different groups impacted by ableism and saw how ableism impacts not only people with disabilities, but also our communities at large. We looked at a few case examples where individuals and families experienced ableism. Part 3 will take a deeper dive into what ableism looks like. The goal of this part of the program is to be able to identify ableism so that we can avoid it in our own lives. Let's get started. In part 1, we learned that ableism is both affective and behavioral. The affective is an internal process associated with attitudes and emotions, and the behavioral refers to actions stemmed from attitudinal reactions. Remember that these all trace back to those beliefs and stereotypes we create, the cognitive, to justify our structural status. In this section, we'll start with the behavioral ableism. Because behavior reflects the things we do, it's easy to see examples of ableism in our behaviors and in the behaviors of others. The behaviors we'll look at center on accessibility, autonomy, inclusion, and communication. After discussing the behavioral, we'll move on to affective ableism. This is a little harder to pin down because it's an internal process. But the impacts of this internal process show up in our language and in how we react to the lives of people with disabilities. Many ableist actions are the result of non-disabled people failing to consider their privilege in a given situation. A common example goes like this. It's a busy holiday season and you're shopping at the mall. You're wearing a coat and carrying several store packages when you realize that you need to use the restroom. Upon entering, you notice several open stalls, including the handicapped stall. You choose the accessible stall so that you have space to take off your coat and hang all of your packages. It seems harmless, especially if there's no one else in the restroom. But at the same time, a parent with a distressed autistic child may be heading in the direction of the restroom to clean up a toilet accident. This is just one example of how we can forget to consider accessibility. Some other places where we fail to consider accessibility are sharing images on social media that don't have text descriptions. This limits access for people with vision impairments or who use screen readers. Offering services by voice only, for example, call our office to schedule an appointment, can limit access for people who are deaf or non-speaking. Planning events at venues that don't have wheelchair access ramps limits access for people with physical disabilities. Making food an event focus. A food focus can limit access for people with food allergies, disabilities that impact feeding, or food-related mental illness. Failing to make accommodations for sensory needs. This can limit access for autistic people and people with sensory differences. Distributing information without a simplified version. This limits access for people with intellectual disabilities. This list is by no means exhaustive, but it offers some examples of the ways accessibility can be limited across many different types of disabilities. Disabled people are unique individuals with likes, dislikes, talents, and dreams, just like everyone else. Yet there are numerous examples where people with disabilities are not given the opportunity to be in charge of their own lives because non disabled people make assumptions about their autonomy. These situations are complicated because in the interactions, the non disabled person is usually well intentioned. Some examples of this include helping a disabled person to move past an obstacle, for example, crossing a street, without first asking whether they would like assistance. Performing an activity for a person with a disability without giving them the chance to do it themselves. Or calling attention to yourself or a disabled person after being asked for assistance with an obstacle or activity. For example, saying something like, "It's so lucky I was here to help you." Another way that people with disabilities may struggle with autonomy happens when non disabled others make decisions about what's best for them. A recent Facebook post by Jess Wilson at A Diary of a Mom showed that her daughter, who was approaching her 18th birthday, had requested a Blues Clues birthday call as a gift. When Wilson tried to enter her daughter's birth date on the registration form, she received a message that her daughter was too old for this experience. Wilson's argument was that Nickelodeon Network had made a decision based on an interpretation of what they believed was acceptable for an adult, and chose to limit access to something that would have given Wilson's daughter joy. The story has a happy ending. Wilson was able to connect with the creators of Blue's Clues, and the age limit on birthday calls was removed. In some cases, full autonomy isn't appropriate, for example, with parents of a minor child. But even in these cases, we can always find ways to include our loved ones in the decision-making process. Social media is full of stories about disabled children who are the only ones not invited to birthday parties. While these examples come to mind most readily when thinking about avoiding and excluding, there are many more subtle examples as well. In some cases, exclusion is a factor of accessibility. For example, how do you include a child who uses a wheelchair at a backyard pool party when the pool is above ground and inaccessible? Other cases make assumptions based on misunderstood autonomy. We're not going to invite him because he wouldn't be able to do it anyhow. Perhaps the most painful examples of avoiding and exclusion occur when people with disabilities are not included as a result of fears. According to Nario Redman, ancient people may have developed a survival instinct that helped them to avoid others who looked ill. Those equipped to recognize conditions like plague or disease were more likely to survive, so this trait has been handed down. While modern medicine has made this trait less necessary for survival, it's still present in the way we behave. Nario Redman referenced several studies where researchers observed how close people were willing to sit to someone with a disability in a waiting room. In a large percentage of the cases, people chose to seat themselves as far as possible from a disabled person, even if that put them in close proximity to others who were not disabled. Nario Redman cites Goldberg et al., saying, "What it means to be truly human is often described in terms of abilities, language, self-reflection, and independence, abilities that distinguish humans from other animals." While animals use many different forms of communication, our use of language is one of the things that sets humans apart. And yet, because people with disabilities have historically been dehumanized, beliefs that they are unable to participate in communication persist even today. Because of these beliefs, many non-disabled individuals speak to people with disabilities using childish language, or they may ignore disabled people altogether in favor of speaking to a caregiver or attendant. Inspiration porn is a good transition between behavioral ableism and effective ableism because it contains components of both. If you've never heard of the phrase before, it comes from disabled comedian and activist Stella Young. In 2014 TED Talk, Young told members of the audience, and these images, there are lots of them out there, they are what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. Examples of inspiration porn range from memes shared on social media to news stories about non disabled students asking a disabled student to prom. In each case, the person with a disability is objectified in order to make non disabled people feel better about their lives. This brings us to language. While communicating is technically a behavior, the words we choose to communicate are part of a complex process that is influenced by our emotions and attitudinal reactions. Everyone can remember a time when they blurted out something they wish they could take back after getting angry. In the same way, our internal processes impact how we talk about things and what we say. Most ableist language reflects implicit beliefs. Implicit means implied, and implicit beliefs can be so enmeshed with who we are that we don't even know we have them. For example, when you're in a crowded area and you need to make a path from one side to the other, you instinctively go to the right. The fact that we travel to the right is implicit knowledge in American culture. No one tells us to go to the right. Instead, we've learned this behavior over time by witnessing it in others. The same thing can happen with beliefs about other people. In most cases, our parents didn't sit us down and explicitly say, disabled people are bad, they are less than you. We absorb this knowledge from our environment based on media portrayals, experiences with the behaviors of others, and so on. Project Implicit, a website maintained by Harvard University, offers several online implicit association tests, or IATs, that can help you understand your level of implicit bias. An IAT assumes that we can make connections based on implicit attitudes very quickly. For example, non-disabled equals good. When we're asked to make connection that goes against an implicit attitude, it takes us longer to respond. I've included a link to Project Implicit at the end of this part in case you'd like to try it yourself. It's a great tool that can help you learn more about your biases. As we explore this section on language, we'll look at 3 types of ableist language that are most common. There are definitely more, but with an understanding of these 3, you can begin to improve your awareness. Throughout history, many terms and phrases have been used to describe disabilities. In 1858, Dr. S.G. Howe published an article in the Journal of Psychological Medicine and Mental Pathology titled On the Causes of Idiocy. This article represented the first time that different categories of intellectual disability were widely communicated in the medical community. Howe's terms include idiots, fools, simpletons, and imbeciles. While Howe's terms were intended for use as medical classifications, they eventually became part of the common language where they were used to describe people or animals that were unappealing. Over time, the terms took on a primary role as insults and were dropped from the medical use. The same has happened with words like moron, cripple, retarded, and crazy. In some cases, the use of outdated terms has become so inflammatory that campaigns were created to remove the term from common language entirely. Retarded, or the R word, was once a diagnostic term that has been misused in such abusive ways that there's no longer a sanctioned use of the word. In 2010, President Barack Obama signed Rose's Law, which replaced the terms mentally retarded with intellectual disability, emphasizing the dignity and self-worth of people with intellectual disabilities. When the law was signed, Rose's brother, Nick Marcelino, shared a powerful meaning behind changing the language in the quote. He said, "Some say we shouldn't care about the words, just the way we treat people. But if you think about it, what you call people is how you treat people. If we change the words, maybe it'll be the start of a new attitude toward people with intellectual disabilities, and they deserve it." In other cases, groups within the disability community have created campaigns to take back words that non-disabled people have turned into insults. The word crip, short for cripple, is one example of a word that the disability community has taken back with a social media campaign like Crip the Vote. Taking back terms can be a source of empowerment, as this tweet from disability activist Lawrence Carter Long illustrates. Carter Long, a disability activist with cerebral palsy, started the Say the Word campaign in response to Barack Obama's 2016 State of the Union address. In this speech, Obama was careful to acknowledge diverse groups from across the country, but failed to mention people with disabilities even once. According to Carter Long, acknowledging the word disabled and allowing people to claim this word as part of their identities is not only empowering, it allows them to be seen. In an interview with NPR, Carter Long stressed that to suggest disability is simply a difference and has no impact on a person's life is a very privileged position to take. Most disabled people don't have that luxury. The assertion flies in the face of reality and minimizes the very real discrimination disabled people face. It's worth noting that not everyone feels the same about taking back outdated terms. In the replies to Carter Long's tweet, many people offered disagreements, saying that the term had connotations of being less than or broken. According to the Google Dictionary, a euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. A common example of a euphemism is saying, the employee was let go, instead of saying, the employee was fired. Despite efforts to take back the term, the word disabled is still associated with negative connotations. To avoid that negative, icky feeling the word disable invokes, indirect descriptions are substituted. These may include differently abled, challenged, as in mentally challenged, physically challenged, etc., handicapable, and special needs. Disability euphemisms are troubling for a couple of reasons. First, they can infantilize disability conditions. Imagine reporting to work at a new job and telling your employer, I'm handy-capable and I would like to talk to you about some accommodations. Disability euphemisms can also create divides where we need inclusion. An educational campaign created for World Down Syndrome Day in 2017 included a video where actors with Down syndrome suggested that special needs should include things like eating dinosaur eggs for breakfast or wearing a full suit of armor. The video concludes that people with Down syndrome don't need something special. They have the same needs as everyone else: access to education, jobs, opportunities, friendships, and love. As with our discussion of outdated terms, it's important to note that some people with disabilities embrace euphemisms because these terms are empowering to them. It's important to recognize that the disability community is extremely diverse and to defer to individual preference. Another way that ableism creeps into our language is through the use of dehumanizing words and phrases. Consider the common phrase wheelchair bound. What does it bring to mind first? A person or a mobility device that's somehow attached to a person? If I told you that my child suffers from autism, can you find anything in that statement that communicates the incredible strength that my child demonstrates each day when she contends with the challenges her disability presents? Or do you only see a victim? What if I told you that crazy person lived next door to me? Would you want to meet the sweet neighbor who always remembers your birthday and who also struggles with anxiety and depression? While we may not intend to dehumanize and disempower people with disabilities, careless use of words, phrases, and even images puts them at risk of exposing vulnerabilities in ways that we would not do to a typical person. The National Center on Disability and Journalism offers a thorough style guide with both English and Spanish that can help you identify outdated terms and decide when or why to ask about disability language preferences. While it's a good starting point, it's best to always defer to individual preference. Labels are probably the most complicated component of language associated with disability. The reason for this is because disabled people in America are more diverse than almost any other minority population. Disabled Americans are adults, children, male, female, gender fluid or non-binary, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, rich, poor, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, immigrant, refugee. The list could go on and on because disabled people are part of every demographic in this country. The challenge with having such a diverse list is something called intersectionality. Your intersectionality can best be described as the influences in your life. Intersectionality reflects both sources of power and of oppression that overlap to make you the unique individual that you are. The National Association for Social Work's Ohio chapter presented an interesting exercise in intersectionality as part of their anti-oppression informed practice training. The facilitators posed this question: what 5 things, if they were removed from you, would make you no longer who you are. For an example, I'm a woman, I'm a white American of Central Eastern European descent, I'm a member of the middle class, I'm a parent, I identify as neurodivergent. These things influence every part of my life. Without them, I would not be who I am. People with disabilities have intersectionalities that are every bit as diverse as mine, and their responses to labels and language are influenced by these factors. This is why language choices are often individual preferences. Functioning labels came into our language with Dr. S.G. Howe's 1858 article on the Journal of Psychological Medicine and Mental Pathology called On the Causes of Idiocy. According to Howe, an idiot was worse off than a fool, who was worse off than a simpleton. While the words like fool and simpleton have fallen out of use, many families and practitioners have kept functioning labels and phrases like high functioning autism and severe disability. Those who use functioning labels argue that we need a way of differentiating how much support a person needs in order to be part of the community. To put it another way, these people believe that without a label, their loved ones will not be able to get the services they need. Unfortunately, in today's policy, they're not entirely wrong, but perpetuating the labels isn't helping anyone in the long run. That's because there are some major flaws with this way of thinking. First, labels can be subjective. Consider two disabled adults. One is a non-speaking woman with average intelligence who can make certain life decisions on her own. The other is a man who can communicate with speech, but who needs support in decision-making. Which one's more disabled? The second flaw with functioning labels is environmental impact on a person's disability. For example, a child who is labeled with high-functioning autism may be able to attend school in a mainstream classroom, but may also struggle with debilitating anxiety in order to do so. A severely disabled adult may struggle with activities of daily living, but also have a great sense of humor that makes people enjoy his company. Simply put, functioning labels don't give a full picture of the strengths or challenges of a person with disability faces, and are often misleading at best. No discussion of language as it relates to people with disabilities would be complete without spending some time on person first and identity first language. The People First movement began in 1974 when organizers of a convention on disabilities decided that they needed a name for themselves. A member of the committee mentioned that they were tired of being known for their disability, saying, "I'm tired of being called retarded. We are people first." Disability advocates rapidly claimed person first language, or PFL, which symbolically places the person ahead of a disability diagnosis, as in person with Down syndrome. State legislatures followed, with many enacting laws or guidelines for using person first language, and major disability acts, including the ADA, have been written using person first. Identity first language, or IFL, began to appear in the late 1980s. Despite the fact that PFL was designed to place emphasis on the person, IFL advocates argued that the concept was still anchored in the belief that disability is inherently bad. If, after all, human differences are all perceived as equally contributing to diversity, why would disability be the only difference that was emphatically placed after the person? IFL advocates also argue that you wouldn't call a Black American a person with Blackness, nor should you need to do the same with disability. Despite compelling arguments for PFL, IFL, and other labels, there are no consensus as to which is preferred in the disability community. Because there is so much diversity in the disability community, each of these ways of referring to oneself can be empowering to different people. In a conversation I had recently, a parent shared that her son had chosen the word special needs as a label for himself. She related that to her son, it felt like his needs were special and that using this label empowered him. For that reason, it's best to ask what an individual prefers, or better still, use their given name. Thank you for joining me. This concludes part 3 of this program. In part 4, we'll reflect on what we've learned and share some of the tools that can help you dismantle ableism. Before we go, I'd like once again to thank some of the talented individuals who've helped make this program a reality. Thank you to Charisse Montgomery for your valuable insights into the experiences of Black Americans with disabilities. Sarah Wintemaki has helped to support this program from the beginning with an overwhelming encouragement and with her insights into the experiences of families with disabled minor children. Finally, Lisa Ruman contributed to this project through an extension of her supervision work and by helping me to include systems and empowerment approaches consistent with the social work value. Thank you to each of you for your support.